Welcome to another Football Friday at newsok.com. I'm your host, Darnell Mayberry, joined by all of my work friends on the road. Barry Trammell, columnist, Brooke Pryor, OU writer, and Kyle Fredrickson, OSU beat writer. Guys, we're going to talk OU's 34-24 win over Iowa State last night in a rare Thursday night road game. And then we're going to wrap it up with some OSU football talk, looking ahead to its matchup Saturday at Kansas State. Barry, let's start with you. As I mentioned, OU with a good, nice, solid 34-24 win at Iowa State. What was your big takeaway from that game last night?
My takeaway was the incredible diversity of Dimitri Flowers. Oklahoma basically took their fullback and turned him into a tailback, and he played a wonderful game. He played tailback, he played some back, he played slot back, he played wide receiver. He had 122 yards rushing, 3 passes, 1 for a touchdown on a great catch. He took a shotgun snap and made a first down on 4th down. He drew a interference penalty on a deep ball. He just played a marvelous game, and he showed some pretty good acumen at running the ball that we really didn't know.
I don't know if we lost Barry. Brooke, same question to you. What was your biggest takeaway from last night's win?
Yeah, I think Dimitri Flowers was a big part of that. Kind of looking a little bit on the negative side, is there some questions that OU's had all season that they still haven't been able to answer? You know, Baker Mayfield took 3 sacks last night. He hasn't taken last time he took multiple sacks in the game was against TCU in the Big 12 season opener. So I'm kind of curious as to what happened there. He kind of held on to the ball a couple times too long, and that may have been a product of Joe Mixon being out and Samaje Perine being out. He didn't have the same options that he's had. That to me is just something to watch, especially going into games against like West Virginia. And then they were still struggling with the back shoulder throw. They don't seem to have that cornerback position nailed down. Jordan Parker looked like he was kind of swimming at times out there. But I think those are 2 things that I took away from this game that I'm going to keep an eye on through the last 3 games of the season.
Brooke, all things considered, I mean, you're playing on a short week on the road. Granted, Iowa State came into the game 1-7, but you don't have your 2-star running backs. You have to improvise from a roster standpoint, mixing and matching. Was this a good win for OU last night?
I think so. I mean, at this point, they're still undefeated in the conference, so any win's a good win because they're going to have to continue to win out to get to the Sugar Bowl, which is kind of the biggest goal that they have left this year as far as winning the Big 12. I mean, you look at guys like Jeffrey Mead had a big game. I think looking at the offense, it was really balanced, and in doing that without the superstars, I mean, D.D. Westbrook still had a really good game, but in the first half, everybody was talking about Jeffrey Mead's spin move. So I think this game showed OU's versatility and what they can do, even if it feels like they've got both hands tied behind their back and they're limping on one leg.
Yeah. Barry, let's go back to you. What got into Dimitri Flowers? Bob Stoops obviously recognized him, as you wrote about, after the game in front of the entire team. He finished with 22 carries, 115 yards, had not had a carry in his career prior to last night's game. He added 3 receptions, 34 yards, and a touchdown. As you mentioned, he was incredibly versatile. What got into him last night?
Well, it may be no more complicated than he got a chance. You know, you think a lot about people in all walks of life. If you never get the opportunity, you don't know what somebody can do. And that goes for athletes, that can go for actors, that can go for people on all kinds of jobs. Dimitri Flowers is a good soldier, blue collar guy, blocks, catches passes out of the backfield, special teams. In high school he was an excellent running back, and you could tell last night that he had the instincts. He could see holes. He had patience. He running past his blockers, he would turn he'd turn a 3-yard gain into a 6-yard gain. And while that's not very sexy, while that doesn't really get everybody fired up, that's a winning football play. And I think the longer the game went, the more the OU coaches just began to trust this guy. He had 19 carries in the second half. He had 11 in the fourth quarter, and I think they say they knew what they had in him, but I'm not sure they knew he was this good or this versatile. And for a guy to know that many positions and play flawless, always be in the right spot, just lining up all over the field. To me, it was a breakout performance, and I think everybody in Soonerland now looks at Dimitri Flowers in a new light.
Who needs Joe Mixon and Samaje Perine, right, Brooke?
Exactly. I'm sure half the fan base would fully support that sentence, and the other half, not so much. But really, at this rate, who knows when we're going to see Joe Mixon again? I mean, Bob said last night that it should be a 1-game suspension. But I think there's still some facts that are going to come out of the incident with the parking attendant, and that could maybe impact his status for the last 3 games of the season.
Oh, I want to piggyback on that, Brooke. I mean, for those who don't know, I don't know why you wouldn't know at this point, but Joe Mixon was suspended Thursday night's game for ripping up a parking ticket allegedly in front of a parking attendant and throwing it on the ground, according to his attorney. That's why Dimitri Flowers got the start at tailback and had the career-high 22 carries and had the impressive game against Iowa State. Samaje Perine missed his 3rd consecutive game with a pulled hamstring. So therefore, insert Dimitri Flowers. Barry, what I want to ask you is, did the punishment fit the crime for Joe Mixon?
Oh yeah, I mean if Samaje Perine had done this, he probably wouldn't be suspended, but he's on probation. Joe Mixon, the parameters were laid out 2 years ago. Hey, you can stay, but you're going to sit out this season. You're going to be on a short leash. No more missteps. No more legal authorities calling us. And here comes a situation where we don't know exactly what happened, but enough for a parking enforcement officer to file a complaint. Parking enforcement officers are not the kind of people that are aghast when somebody looks at them funny. Nobody liked them. They're sort of ostracized. They're used to people being mad at them. So something had to happen to instigate this complaint. I don't know what happened. We'll find the report at some point, but it's pretty clear that something happened. And Joe Mixon, he had his marching orders. He had to be purer than Caesar's wife, and didn't happen. So at home he stayed.
Barry, are you under the impression that Joe Mixon perhaps did more than what we know? Do you think there's more to the story? Because who among us hasn't wanted to rip up a parking ticket and throw it up in the air?
Well, I think something else did happen, because like I said, I don't think a parking attendant, a parking enforcement officer makes a complaint of something. They get tickets ripped up all the time on them. And what do they care if you rip up a ticket? It's not their job to put the ticket through all the processes and procedures. They just write them and go on down their business. So what do they care? That's on you if you rip it up. So, I got to believe that something else happened. What, I don't know. It just doesn't make any sense for somebody to write up a ticket. Somebody tears it up and then you go file the complaint. What do you care?
Well, Brooke, let's go back to Dimitri Flowers, and I want to ask you, do you think that this gives the coaching staff now, Barry mentioned that maybe they didn't know what they had in him, do you think this gives them more flexibility going forward now, especially with Samaje Perine's status still unclear going into next week's games?
Yeah, I think it absolutely gives them a lot more flexibility and a lot more room to work with Dimitri Flowers. Put him at running back. Again, you can use him for blocking. That's something that, when they were playing Abdul Adams, he showed that he couldn't really necessarily pick up the blitzes that were happening. That area, he was just kind of not altogether there. So when you have a sure thing guy like Dimitri Flowers you can put all over the field, I think that gives them a lot more flexibility to run the more advanced plays they want to do. They're not trying to help Abdul Adams along. He's going to be a good running back, but right now he's still young. and this gives them a deeper rotation and a position group, especially in the running backs, that was getting really depleted really fast. So I think they've got to feel good about what they learned about Dimitri Flowers at Iowa State.
Guys, also with the offense, Baker Mayfield had 4 touchdown passes again, one to D.D. Westbrook, who seems like he is unstoppable now. Barry, what is going right for D.D. Westbrook right now, and can he be stopped?
Well, you can stop him. Iowa State actually did a pretty good job containing him. They paid for it in some other ways. But D.D. Westbrook has set such a high bar that a game like he had last night, 1 touchdown catch, becomes sort of a so-so game for him. But he's just so fast. He can get deep quickly. Iowa State took away the slants. OU did not throw a slant pattern last night. And that's been a bread and butter for Westbrook. Catches a slant on the dead run. Very hard. He's turned a couple of those into big gainers. So, there are things defense can do, but you pay for it in other areas.
Hey, Brooke, coming into the season, the wide receiver position in the Big 12 wasn't that deep. We all sort of looked at James Washington as the guy head and shoulders above most of the rest. But has D.D. Westbrook now made a case that he could be the best receiver in the Big 12?
I mean, I think so. He's first nationally right now with 12 touchdown receptions, I think. It was 11 going into last night. He's playing the best football, I think, of any wide receiver in the Big 12 and maybe even in the country. That being said, though, OU's going to face some pretty
guys, is that the big center right there, Barry?
OU's going to face some pretty tough wide receivers coming up with Cody Cannon at Baylor and James Washington at OSU. And I think that's going to give everyone a chance to see guys kind of go up against each other in the same game and get a good head-to-head comparison. But right now, I think D.D. Westbrook definitely has the edge. Like Barry said, he has a 1-touchdown game and less than 200 yards, and it's kind of a ho-hum performance. But all things considered, it's still pretty good. And they didn't need him to be a huge playmaker last night with Baker kind of spreading the ball around. I think 7 different guys had receptions. So they're showing that D.D. has the capabilities to be explosive, but they've also got enough backup that he doesn't have to do that every game.
Barry, how has your opinion of D.D. Westbrook changed coming into the season, and particularly his status and where he ranks among Big 12 players, particularly receivers?
Well, for crying out loud, I just thought he was an okay player. In fact, I thought he was a sort of a disappointment last season. Things about him turned out he was just an okay player. And that's sort of what I thought he was this year. In fact, I remember thinking the Sooners were going to have to, be a receiving corps by committee, if you were, sort of like the old Texas Tech teams that didn't have a ton of stars, but spread it all around. Instead, OU's got a home run hitter like they've never had before. I don't know if D.D. Westbrook is better than Mark Clayton or Ryan Shepard. Is much more than those guys. I think he's the fastest OU receiver that I can remember. So he's just making one big play after another. So it's an outstanding development for him. Maybe it's completely related to health. I don't know, but he's certainly become a difference maker.
Brooke, to the untrained eye, it's easy to look at OU play and watch D.D. Westbrook and say, wow, that guy's fast. We can all see his speed, but what else does he do well that makes him so effective?
I mean, you're right. I think the speed is the biggest thing. And he has a remarkable ability to just make some catches, not like a Joe Mixon type where he can just grab the ball down one-handed, but he has good hands. And I think he also is putting himself in the right position at the right time. Going back to the hands thing, I mean, Ryan Neighbor did a story earlier this week when he was sidelined with the muscle pull. He sat there during the commercial breaks watching TV and would just throw the football up in the air and work on catching it. And you can really see how much that paid off with just his touch throughout the season. It's really paying dividends. And who knew that much rest, something that good could come from it.
Okay, guys, one last question. And, Brooke, you can get out of here. We'll turn our attention to OSU and Kyle Fredrickson. But, Barry, let's start with you. I want to ask about the defense. What kind of defensive game was this for OU? We're going to come up on the sort of the meatiest part of their schedule these last 3 games. They did a solid job against Iowa State last night, but again, they came into that game 1-7. Not the toughest test. What did you make of OU's defense last night? And I seem like I ask this question every week. Does this mean they've turned a corner? Looks like Barry's having some issues. Brooke, same question to you. What did you make of OU's defense last night? What kind of game was this for them?
Well, I don't think they turned a corner. I mean, they still gave up 24 points. I think that we saw a return to some things that, like I said earlier, kind of plagued them earlier in the season with those deep throws. Lazard had a big game. I mean, he had 76 yards, but at least one really long touchdown pass. I think that it showed. It was amazing. The defensive line, I mean, they have injuries all over the field, defensive line, linebackers, secondary, and yet the D-line that's had the most injuries still looks the best, I thought. But secondary, looking at Jordan Parker, going to have to figure out something to do with that cornerback position because they're still struggling there. But Micaiah Quick could be back, I think, in the next 2 weeks, 1 to 2 weeks. We haven't really gotten an update on him recently, so that's something we'll have to check into. But no, I don't. I think the Kansas game was good, but it wasn't against a good offense. This game was a little bit tougher, and they still gave up 24 points. So I don't think that they've turned a corner quite yet.
Brooke, I think when we look back on this season, I mean, I think we're all going to have to give OU credit, regardless of how bad some of the results have looked defensively at times. I think we're going to have to look back and give them credit for how they've hung in there and withstood so many injuries this season to that side of the ball.
Oh, absolutely. That's been the story kind of on the defensive side. And I mean, Bob Stoops and Mike Stoops are both kind of just confounded by the number of injuries they've had. I want to say it was something like 10 guys that have started at some point have all missed time on the defensive side. And yet they're able to keep bringing up next guy after next guy with young ones like Caleb Kelly and Ricky Berry, Jordan Parker. Yeah, they're just able to keep refilling that. And eventually they're going to get these other guys healthy for the last 3 games. And now they've built depth for next season, and that's a big positive that they can take out of it.
All right, thanks, Brooke. We'll turn our attention to OSU now, and you're watching Football Friday at newsok.com. I'm Darnell Mayberry, joined by Barry Trammell, columnist, and Kyle Fredrickson. They're all on the road, either coming back from Iowa State, where OU won last night 34-24, and OSU is about to play Kansas State tomorrow afternoon. Kyle, let's bring you in here. We're talking about the OU defense. Let's talk about OSU's defense now, particularly the Cowboys' defensive line. Bob Clemens, the defensive line coach, has really transformed that unit. How's he done it? What's working well for him right now in that unit?
Well, this is a good week to sort of look at Joe Bob. He's a Kansas State grad, was a walk-on for the football team, who became a student assistant, a graduate assistant, and then a full-time coach before eventually making his way to Stillwater. But this is sort of a defensive line that over the past decade of Cowboy football has had its peaks and valleys, but mostly valleys, that they haven't put out a ton of NFL talent. But just recently with Emmanuel Ogbah being drafted to the Cleveland Browns, Jimmy Bean making it into camp with the Raiders, they've really built some momentum with this group, and it shows in the depth they have this year. As it stands right now, there's 7 different OSU defensive linemen with at least 1 sack this year, and they rotate those guys in and out like hockey line changes. So when you're playing in these spread offenses and you need as much depth and healthy bodies as possible, nowhere on this OSU team is that embodied as the defensive line. And a lot of that credit has to go to Joe Bob, who really was a Bill Snyder disciple. A lot of the characteristics we see in a Snyder coach team, I think we're seeing some of that with this defensive line unit. So I know for Joe Bob, it's pretty difficult for him to go back to Manhattan and be on that opposing sideline because I think at heart he'll probably always be a Wildcat.
Kyle, you always hear about the teams taking on their coach's personality. Do you feel like this defensive line has taken on Joe Bob Clemens' personality?
I think so. That's sort of what players have told me this week for the story I'm writing in Saturday's newspaper. Joe Bob is a guy who likes to have fun in the film room. They're always cracking jokes. But he's as intense as he is as a coach as he was as a player. He wants his players to be gritty, tough, almost mean guys. And when he kind of shows that in practice, when he handles his guys a certain way, I think that carries itself over. And anyone who's been watching Vincent Taylor this season can see shades of that, just with how violent he is. We saw him strip the ball away from Skylar Howard in that West Virginia game. setting up a huge turnover that led to points for the Cowboys. Really has been their recipe for success, and it starts up front. It starts with the pressure OSU's been able to get the quarterback, and even without being an Agba, they've done a heck of a job this year.
Hey, Barry, I want to get your take on it. What have you noticed out of Coach Clements and how he's transformed that defensive line for the Cowboys?
Well, what I always thought of Joe Bob Clement, when I think of Joe Bob, I think of how far OSU football program has come. We're talking about a K-State guy. We're talking about a guy who played there, graduated there, came up under Bill Snyder, and basically jumped ship to go work for Mike Gundy at a similar job. So to me, that showed that the ascension of the Cowboy program when they could attract a coach like the caliber of Joe Bob Clement. I remember, and a lot of people will remember, not that long ago, defensive line was the annual deficiency on the OSU football team, not just the defense, but the entire football team. Just never have enough good defensive linemen. And now here, it's really sort of the strength of the team, along with maybe the passing game with Rudolph to those receivers. But the defensive line has just been stellar. It's got a lot of depth. It's guys that some were good recruits, recruits, and he's just done a wonderful job developing those guys. And now it's the strength of the team.
Kyle, OSU has had a lot of takeaways this year. How much is that a credit to that defensive line putting pressure on opposing quarterbacks?
Yeah, I think it's been big. A lot of these OSU turnovers here have been kind of fluky deflections off passes and some weird things happen in the secondary, all these laterals we've seen. But in terms of kind of shaking that up and getting the process started, there's no better way to do it than with having that pressure on the defensive line. Right now, OSU is third in the league in sacks, and they're getting a lot of different guys to do it. As Barry said, they're so deep. They come in with these rotations with first-year JUCO guys who've done a great job. Trelund Weber, DeQuinton Osborne, these are two first-year guys who already are become effective in the sack game and have been effective on the inside and on the edge. So certainly when we talk about this defense's ability to switch field positions, it starts with that line getting pressure up front.
All right, Kyle, let's switch gears to the offensive side of the ball a little bit. Mason Rudolph, another incredible game last week. He's really played well this season. But last week in the upset against West Virginia, he relied on the intermediate ball. Do you think that this week he could get back to that deep ball against Kansas State tomorrow afternoon?
I think it's definitely possible. We saw with that 3-3-5 defense was just with all those defensive backs and Baylor's secondary stacked up, they took away that deep ball and Rudolph had to throw it inside. His longest completion was a short slant to James Washington, who really just kind of did all the rest once he caught the ball just a few yards past the line of scrimmage. I would assume that they'd get back to the deep ball a little bit more. That's really their identity with the weapons they have outside. Just looking at the stats, Kansas State's given up almost 40 plays of 20 yards or more. I was in the stands for the OU Kansas State game. D.D. Westbrook had that 88-yard touchdown late. Joe Mixon threw a touchdown, with another deep ball. So I'd look at that game and look at the weapons that OSU has, and I don't really see a reason why, we might not see a bit of a revival when it comes to getting it downfield.
Barry, did you see anything in that OU K-State game that bodes well for OSU tomorrow afternoon in terms of the passing game, and particularly the deep ball?
Yeah, I've actually, if you look at Kansas State for several years, the truth of the matter is they are competitive through good, sound football, through structure, through discipline, through just doing everything right. They don't have a bunch of exceptional athletes. And you can, if you get one-on-one with them, but it's the McCleskys and Washingtons and Juwan Seals. I think those kind of guys have such a big edge talent-wise on Kansas State that it's not a good matchup for the Cats. Kansas State did a nice job with Texas's athletes, but Texas doesn't have the quarterback that Oklahoma State does. Oklahoma did. Oklahoma State does. I think OSU's got a big edge. They should win this game, and they should win it with Mason Rudolph passes to
Kyle, Berry just mentioned the possibility of getting K-State secondary in one-on-one matchups. That's something James Washington hasn't seen a lot of lately. And I just mentioned to the OU guys, I asked if Dede Westbrook is making a case as potentially the Big 12's best receiver. Is that a little unfair to James Washington because of the coverages he's seen this season?
Yeah, I think there's no doubt that Westbrook's play has been fantastic. He deserves all the accolades he's been getting, but when we look at these two players in terms of their body type and their physical skill set, I don't think there's any doubt that Washington's the better prospect and the better receiver. But as you mentioned, when teams are so focused on taking him away, there's really nothing the Cowboys can do. And as Barry talked about, with all the weapons they have on the edge, there's no reason they shouldn't spread the ball around. So even with Westbrook's performance, I still think Washington's the best receiver in the Big 12 as it stands right now. As we see this OSU run game develop and as we see Mason Rudolph develop as an intermediate passer, I think defenses are going to have to sort of back off and try to play more of a traditional style like we might see against Kansas State on Saturday to sort of combat the other weapons OSU has. If they can limit Rudolph's effectiveness and they can start turning him over, something he hasn't done to this point, then maybe we scrap that conversation and OSU probably isn't in a position to win a whole lot of ball games. But as it stands now, they've done well even despite Washington getting that much attention just because of all the talent they have in other positions.
Okay, Kyle, give me a couple takeaways or a couple key things to watch, not takeaways, key things to watch tomorrow afternoon for the Cowboys.
Very interested to see how OSU handles the Kansas State quarterback run game. As you might remember, a year ago, they were down to a receiver, Cody Cook, playing the position, and he still ran all over this team. So Kansas State, forever, it seems like, is going to have a mildly athletic quarterback who's able to make plays with his feet. That's the same thing this year. Ertz leads them in rushing. If OSU can sort of take that dimension of this offense away, it has the firepower, I think, to score a whole ton of points. And I think that's really going to be the formula they're going to want to see to get a victory.
Barry, what will you be watching for tomorrow in Manhattan?
look at the OSU defense. 5 years, K-State put up 49, 48.
I think we're having some technical difficulties with Barry, and it's unfortunate because it sounded like a really good answer. Kyle, we'll just wrap it up with this. You mentioned to me earlier that you pointed out OSU hadn't had a night game this year. What's that about, and is this the new norm?
Well, I've said that in haste. They did play Baylor at 6:30. That game sort of was scraped from my memory. There was a crazy rain delay, too. That was a late night. But, yeah, other than that, no night games. No night games at home.
Home night games.
With Texas Tech having an afternoon game. So it is really weird. Mike Gundy said that he prefers to play in the afternoon. He thinks that's when college football should be played. For me, it's great. I like to go home and hopefully catch the end of a Pac-12 game after a long day of work. Hopefully that'll be the case after tomorrow.
Yeah, you can't tell a sports writer or editor that a day game is not better than a night game. That's for sure, especially with our deadlines these days. Hey, thanks, Kyle. We appreciate it. That's all for Football Friday. For the best college football coverage anywhere, stay right here at newsok.com and make sure to read us every day in the Oklahoman.